The market that day was alive with the usual clamor of voices, each merchant raising his tone to be heard over the next, shouting out prices of wheat, fabric, spices, and livestock. The smell of sweat, dust, and roasted nuts lingered in the hot air, but there was one sound, sharper and crueler, that began to draw attention from every direction. A man, ragged in clothes but hard in face, stood upon a wooden crate, not with sacks of grain to offer, not with goats or tools, but with his 3 daughters standing before him like trembling animals caught in a trap. Their eyes were wide, filled with shame and disbelief, as his voice rang out above the marketplace noise, shouting numbers, offers, promises to whoever would take them. The youngest girl clung desperately to the arm of the eldest, who tried to stand tall though her chin quivered. The middle sister held her hands tight to her chest, biting her lips so hard it nearly bled. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, some men laughing cruelly at the absurdity, others whispering to one another, some tempted by the vile bargain though they did not dare step closer. The father's eyes darted from one face to the next, greedy and desperate, his voice rising each time the silence stretched too long. From the edge of the crowd, a tall man watched, his brow furrowed and jaw tight as if holding back a storm within. His life had shown him poverty, hardship, and cruelty before, but this was different. This was a betrayal of the very bond a parent was meant to honor. He could hardly believe that the girl's own father had cast them into the jeering eyes of strangers. The man's hands curled into fists as the father gestured with rough impatience, trying to turn his daughters around like one would a mule for inspection. The girl's tears reflected in the dusty sunlight, glinting like broken glass, and that was the moment the tall man knew he could no longer stand by as a silent witness. He began to push his way through the bodies, his presence parting the crowd as if they felt the weight of his intent before he even reached the front. Murmurs hushed, laughter died, and the girls turned their heads slowly, eyes catching a glimpse of him through their veil of tears. The father, mistaking his determination for interest, smiled a greedy smile and called out louder, already convinced that he had found his buyer. The tall man stood face to face with the trembling sisters, but his eyes were fixed on their father, who now shifted from one foot to the other as if the ground beneath him had suddenly turned unsteady. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something out of the ordinary was about to unfold. The father opened his mouth, spitting excuses about hunger, about debts, about the harshness of life, his words dripping with self-pity rather than shame. He waved his arms, gesturing to the people around him, trying to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, but the man before him raised a hand, firm and commanding, and silence fell over the marketplace. His voice carried the weight of authority, sharp enough to pierce the noise of the crowd and land directly in the ears of the father. "How dare you," he said, his tone steady, burning with disgust, "parade your own children before strangers as if they were cattle to be traded." The words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last, and the crowd stirred uneasily, their earlier amusement shrinking into shame. Some lowered their eyes, while others looked on in anticipation of what would follow. The father's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing in defiance, but the strength in his bluster had already been broken. He stammered about money again, about the impossible weight of debts, but the man's expression did not change. Instead of arguing further, he reached into his coat and drew forth the leather purse, heavy with coins. The sound of metal clinking together cut through the tension like a blade. He stepped forward, holding the purse in his palm, and without a glance at the father's greedy face, he set it down upon the wooden crate. "Your debts are paid," he declared, his voice echoing across the square, "and you will have no further excuse to dishonor them." Gasps rippled through the crowd, astonishment mingled with admiration, and the sisters stared in disbelief at this stranger who had spoken not with negotiation but with command. The father hesitated, torn between shame and the lure of money, but it no longer mattered. The man's gaze shifted from him to the sisters, his eyes softening as he extended his arm. The eldest sister faltered for a moment, suspicion clouding her face, her body frozen in fear of yet another cruel trick. Yet there was something in the firmness of his voice, something in the steadiness of his presence, that broke through her hesitation. She stepped forward first, her sisters clinging to her sides, and slowly they followed him away from the hungry eyes of the marketplace. The estate stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by fields that glowed golden under the sun and orchards heavy with fruit. To the three sisters, who had known only a life of neglect and hardship, the sight of the spacious courtyard, the clean stone paths, and the gentle breeze carrying the scent of bread from the kitchen was almost too much to believe. They entered hesitantly, their bare feet brushing against the smooth floor as if they were afraid it might vanish beneath them. The man's wife, a woman of kind eyes and gentle hands, met them at the door with no questions and no judgment. She led them inside, her voice softer and soothing, as if she had already known the pain they carried. Warm water was brought, and each girl was given fresh garments, soft wool and cotton that felt strange against skin long used to coarse rags. Their stomachs, hollow and weak from neglect, were filled with bread, honey, and milk until their trembling subsided. For the first time in what felt like years, their bodies began to relax, though their hearts were still unsure. Soon after, the man introduced his three sons. The eldest, tall and steady, spoke little at first, but when the eldest sister caught his gaze, she saw neither mockery nor pity but respect. Their conversations began slowly, with careful words, but she felt that he truly listened when she spoke, something she had never known before. The middle son, with laughter in his eyes and a gentleness in his tone, found ways to ease the silence around the second sister. He teased lightly, told her small stories of his days in the fields, and slowly, her guarded heart softened, laughter escaping her lips like sunlight breaking through clouds. The youngest son, kind and full of simple joys, shared his love for the animals he cared for. He showed the youngest sister a small lamb, spoke of the seasons, and handed her wildflowers he had gathered himself. She, shy and uncertain, began to look forward to his quiet company, finding comfort in his unassuming warmth. Days passed into weeks, and though shadows of their past still lingered, the bond between the families grew stronger. What had begun in despair slowly wove itself into a life of trust, respect, and the faint glimmer of hope that perhaps their fates had been guided toward this place for a reason. The estate was alive with music and laughter, lanterns strung high above the courtyard casting a golden glow over the celebration. Neighbors from the village gathered, curious and joyful, bringing gifts of bread, fruits, and flowers to honor the occasion. The three sisters, once seen trembling in the dust of the marketplace, now stood clothed in garments of white and embroidered silk, their faces radiant with smiles that had once seemed impossible. The eldest, her posture now proud and steady, walked beside the man's eldest son, their eyes meeting often with the quiet understanding that spoke louder than words. The second, gentle and graceful, stood hand in hand with the middle son, her laughter bubbling as he whispered to her with that same humor that had first drawn her out of silence. The youngest, shy but now blooming with youthful joy, leaned toward the youngest son, clutching the bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered that very morning, her cheeks glowing with both nerves and happiness. The vows were spoken in the presence of family and community, not in haste nor under force, but with sincerity that brought many to tears. The man who had rescued them stood to the side, his chest swelling with pride, knowing that the choice he had made in the marketplace had forever altered not only the girls' lives but also his own family's destiny. His wife, watching the young couples, wiped her eyes and smiled, her heart warmed by the harmony unfolding before her. Music rose, and the guests danced, filling the courtyard with the sound of joy, each moment erasing the dark memory of where it had all begun. The villagers who had once witnessed the father's cruel auction now marveled at the sight of what love and kindness could restore, some whispering to one another of how quickly fate could turn when courage intervened. The sisters, once resigned to despair, now laughed, their voices mingling with the music as though they had been reborn. The lanterns glowed brighter as night fell, and the estate shimmered with the light not only of candles and stars but of new beginnings, of families joined, and of wounds mended by compassion and honor.